Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Inspiring Leadership podcast. I am very honored to have a really experienced leadership coach, someone who works with CEOs all the time on some of the courses that he runs, but also he's got a great background in business and also in rugby, where he was captain of the rugby Scottish team and had some very successful episodes and gongs to his name. Talking of gongs, he also got an OBE for all that he's done for society and for sport and for society as general. But without further ado, I'll hand over and let him explain what he's doing now.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. I suppose my day job is I work as the managing partner of a business called the School for CEOs, which was set up by myself and Patrick Macdonald, back in 2011 now. And the premise is to try and help business leaders become more effective business leaders by learning from other business leaders. So we have a faculty of about 120 chief execs, chairs, non-exec directors who come and share their experiences and war stories. But increasingly, we've extended that work into inclusive leadership. We believe inclusive leadership is a really important element of what makes an effective leader in an organization. And we have other capabilities. I've been coaching, as you said, working as an executive coach now for over 22 years, which is slightly scary when you say it out loud. And I do a lot of work with teams and executive teams and boards to help them be more effective in what they're doing on a day-to-day basis in their businesses. And we also do a little bit of profiling and assessment. So we've got a fairly broad service offering and a bunch of colleagues who really enjoy working with.
Oh, well, David Sole, it's lovely having you here on the series. And particularly for me, it's always been very interesting as I was getting into leadership and executive coaching. You were in organizations like Pricer and the Change Partnership, which I was always watching what you were doing because it was quite early days. I came into coaching when I was working in PricewaterhouseCoopers and had just left the army about like you, about 25 years ago. And I met these people who were called coaches. And I went, that's just strange. And they took the PwC partnership board. We all went to, I think, Sweden, to some islands in Sweden. And they started to do this coaching thing with them. And I went, this is so cool. I could do this. I really like what they're doing. And so I think both of us were there at the beginning of what was happening. And your reputation in the industry is very high. You know, you're seen there as sort of someone that people admire and respect, particularly for the humility and the humanity of all that you've achieved and all the things you do. You're also chair of the Worldwide Cancer Research, and you've done an awful lot, hence your OBE. People recognize what you've put back into society, but also I think the rugby side is so very interesting. Do you want to just say, you know, how you draw back on your rugby experience and your experience in the organizations in the alcohol industry? I'll call it that. I don't know how you describe it, but the drinks industry. How you bring all that experience together with your leadership coaching. There's a nice blend of all sorts of experiences there, aren't there?
Sure. I don't think there's anything explicit that I bring from my experiences in sport. You have to remember that I'm old enough to have played in the amateur era of rugby, where, we did it for fun, we did it for enjoyment, and it was our recreation that we did on a Saturday afternoon and, trained on a Tuesday or a Thursday night to prepare for that. And, the more keen and enthusiastic amongst us did a bit of extra training on a Monday and a Wednesday. But, it was recreational. So we all had to have jobs. And I was fortunate enough to work in the Scotch whisky industry for 9 years. And then latterly, after Guinness and Graham merged to form Diageo, I spent another 2 years doing an international role for them. And that was a brilliant experience. Just, you might think that the drinks industry would be quite a fun place to work, given the product. And you'd be absolutely right. We were very proud of our brands. And for a Scotsman to work in the Scotch whisky industry, it's just like a dream come true, really. But I think the period that I was playing rugby for Scotland, I was very fortunate to work with some outstanding coaches. And as my first experience of business coaching was during a change program that United Distillers were going through, and we all learned how to build a kind of rudimentary coaching skill set as a leader. And it really resonated for me because people like Sir Ian McGeechan, adopted those approaches naturally and intuitively. And I'm convinced that that was one of the reasons why he was and remains, one of the most successful coaches in the world. Jim Telfer, a very different approach, schoolmaster to trade, and took a very sort of directive approach, but as a blend and as a complement. They were an ideal team to work together with a bunch of people who came from, extraordinarily different backgrounds. You had Gary Armstrong, who was a lorry driver. You had Finlay Golder, who was a grain trader. You had Chris Gray, who was a dentist. And so you had all of these different and diverse backgrounds, as I say, coming together on a Saturday afternoon and pulling on a blue shirt and trying to do well for the country and the sort of 5 million or 6 million people who are following us. And I think, there's lots of things where you can look at leadership and teamwork and bringing, people together behind a common purpose and behind a common ambition and dream for you in a team environment, in a sporting environment. And lots of characteristics and attributes which lend themselves really well to that. But also there's some significant differences. I think sport tends to be very binary in outcomes. You either win or you lose. Okay, you can draw, but the outcomes are really clear, and it's also very event based. You're playing in a Five Nations or as a Six Nations now or a World Cup, and so you're building and peaking or trying to peak for those specific events. Whereas, in business, it's much more relentless. Okay, you have year ends, but the pressure never comes off. The dial still keeps turning up, and the bar still keeps being raised. So, I think there are some really strong similarities and things that you can learn from sport, and particularly, from a values-based perspective. I think the values in the sport that I played are really strong and really do translate exceptionally well into the work environment. And those are really important aspects of how you build strong teams and absolutely consistent whatever walk of life you're in.
No, it's fascinating. And then we were talking earlier about inspiring leaders that you've known, but also qualities that you've picked up in all the CEOs that you had through your programs. And you gave a call out for Patrick Macdonald, who was the CEO of John Menzies, and also set the CEOs school for CEOs up with you. What are the kind of qualities that you admire in people that you describe as inspiring leaders? Are there some things that have stood out for you in business?
Yeah, I think top of the list has to be emotional intelligence. It has to be, leaders who are emotionally intelligent, I think, are the ones who, I suppose I'm drawn towards or have a really strong affiliation with. Undoubtedly that you've got to be smart to be a CEO of an organization. You've got to have book smarts. You've got to have intellect. You've got to have kind of that intellectual rigor. But the ones, organizations are based on people and based around people. And if you can't inspire, mobilize, create followership amongst your people, then you're going to struggle. And I think the ability to connect with not only your CFO or your chair or whoever it is on the board, but also the person who might be, collecting trolleys in a car park or unloading a lorry of, full of bricks or building a wall or doing, and inspiring at every level of the organization. It's the great Kipling poem, if you can walk with kings yet not lose the common touch. It's leaders who have that ability to make people feel great about themselves. I remember being at an event in Hong Kong with Sir Tom McKillop, who had been chief executive of AstraZeneca and at the time was chairman of RBS. when you were in his company, he made you feel really important, and he always demonstrated that he felt you were he was really interested in you, and was curious about who you were, what you did, and for 3 to 5 minutes you'd have a conversation with him, and he'd then in a brilliant way sort of exit the conversation and go and move on to the next person, and manage his way around the crowd absolutely brilliantly. But for those 3 or 5 minutes, you felt that you were the most important person in the world to him, and that made you feel really good. And I think it's that ability to really connect with people, and just understand the simplest things can have the biggest impact. I remember when I was lucky enough to lead Scotland to the Grand Slam in 1990. I got a letter from Sir Anthony Greener, who was at that point the chairman of Guinness, and he had taken the time to sit down and write a 2-page letter, handwritten note to me, saying how proud he was that I was a colleague of his, but equally how disappointed he was as an Englishman that I'd given them we'd given them a good cuffing. But for him to take the time and spend 5 or 10 minutes penning a handwritten note to me, I thought that's really impressive, and I really valued that, and it made me feel really great about it. And so having that sort of ability, I thought was fantastic, and it's the sort of thing that I think leaders should really look to emulate.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. When you meet someone who really makes you feel like you're the only person in the room, but then they have that ability to seamlessly move on to someone else without making you feel you've been worked over, or the person who goes, "Hello, David. Yes, very interesting," and they're looking over your sort of shoulder at the drinks party for someone more interesting than you. And perhaps it never happens to you, but it certainly happens.
It happens all the time. It happens all the time.
Okay, well, look, in your life journey, I'm sure there's moments where that might have happened, but I'd love to hear, just in a bit of time, about the life journey that you went on and how it shaped you, some of the people who influenced you to be the leader you are today, to do the things you do, because it is fascinating. Everybody has a unique story, but it explains a lot about the kind of leader they are today. So would you just tell us a bit?
Oh, how far back do you want to go, Jonathan?
Go back to childhood, how you brought up in West Aberdeenshire.
Yeah. Well, I as you say, I was brought up in West Aberdeenshire, and my 2 sisters are a good bit older than me. So it felt a little bit like I was an only child, because I say my sisters were 9 and 13 years older than me. So they sort of disappeared off to school and university or life as I was growing up. But I had a very sort of happy time in the hills of West Aberdeenshire. It's a glorious place to live and to be brought up. I went away to boarding school, my prep school, from 8 to probably about the age of 12. I hated. I was not particularly keen on mainly being away from my dog, my Jack Russell Terrier, rather than my parents. But the last couple of years, when you become a big fish in a small pond, that becomes a little bit more appealing, and you get to play in the cricket team and the rugby team and the hockey team and all these sorts of things. And sport was a really important part of my life from a very early age. I went on to Glenalmond after that, and sport continued to be a really important part of my life there. And in some respects, we talk a lot on our programs about role models and leaders as role models. The sporting, or the people who are successful in sports, were role models for me, and they were the sort of people that I aspired to be as I was growing up. And they had special things, so that, for example, when you got into the first 15, you got to wear white shorts with your blue jersey, as opposed to blue shorts with your blue jersey in all the other teams. And that was something which marked someone apart. And so it became a target to aim for me, and something to aspire to. And so I became really focused on that. And as I say, rugby was my sport and what I really aspired to. And I was lucky enough to be elevated. There was an injury in the team for a particularly important match against one of the Edinburgh schools, and I got elevated from the under-16 team, which was unheard of in those days. You played at your age group level, but I got picked up from the under 16s and put into the first 15 to play against 18-year-olds in this Edinburgh side. But I got to wear my white short. I got to go and buy my white shorts from the sports shop, and that was a really sort of seminal moment for me, and a moment which it really felt that I'd made it in that regard. So those sorts of things were the things which really drove me at school. I was I had aspirations to be a vet. I think in my teens, having been an avid reader of the James Herriot novels and living in the country, and thought that would be a fantastic career to pursue. But I guess I wasn't as particularly oriented towards the sciences as compared to languages, and I made my choices based on my career aspiration to be a vet. But I think that was probably the one thing that I would change in life. If I had the opportunity to go around again. I much preferred languages, and I was probably better at languages as well. And so I'd have pursued that. But it took me down a certain route. When I was choosing my universities, I sat an Oxbridge exam, but was clearly not smart enough to do languages, to do sciences at Cambridge. So didn't get in there. It was coupled with unfortunately, the year that I applied to Magdalen to do that, they had a change of admissions tutor who wanted to get rid of the image of Magdalen being a college for rugby players and cricketers, which was the principal reason why I had applied to Magdalen. So that was a bit of a shame. So I then looked at my UCAS list of universities and compared them with the rugby fixtures list. So I looked at Loughborough and Exeter, which had just merged with St Luke's, which is the PE college, as my two kind of principal target universities, and was offered a place to read agricultural economics at Exeter. And that again was a kind of defining moment for me in terms of my rugby journey, because I was, as a fresher, I was the only fresher invited down to pre-season. And as with these guys who were absolute monsters, I'd never seen people quite as big as they breed them a wee bit bigger down south compared to up north in Scotland, or were late developers or something. But it felt like proper serious rugby, and it was a real education. It was kind of thrown in the deep end, and the sides that we were playing against in Exeter and Devon and Plymouth, these sorts of sides, used to see students as fresh meat and an opportunity to be a bit of a bully. So you had to grow up pretty quickly and learn how to look after yourself in that environment. But it stood me in really good stead, and was a very important foundation in my rugby career.
Yeah, and your parents were brought up in the war, weren't they? What kind of influence did your father and your mother have on the man you are today, if you look back?
Yeah, they both served in the war. My mother was a WAF up in Scotland, and my father served in the infantry in the Hampshire Regiment. And they both went up to Cambridge after the war and met there, and got married in 1947, I think it was. Very different people, but very incredibly supportive. My mother was a lovely woman, very gentle, incredibly strong value set, and incredibly kind and loving mother, as many mothers are. My dad, I didn't have the easiest of relationships with my dad, particularly latterly. I don't think he really approved of my choice of wife, but which created a bit of tension. But very loving grandfather, loving father, and I think I was very fortunate they provided or created the environment for me to thrive and to make my own choices and my own mistakes as well, rather than forcing me down a certain route, which I was extremely grateful for. And so they're fantastic.
Yeah, well, no, thank you for that. And really, from all your life experiences, and you've had so many varied experiences, a lot of things to celebrate. What would you pick out as a happiest, proudest moment? And what would you pick out as a darkest saddest personal moment. And a bit like Rudyard Kipling, as you mentioned, treat those two imposters just the same.
Mm. I take incredible joy and pride from watching my children play sport. And, they've all gone on to, wear a blue shirt with a thistle on it at different levels. So my eldest son played for the Scottish clubs against the Irish clubs at rugby. My daughter represented Scotland in the 2014 Commonwealth Games and at the 2015 World Cup for netball. And my two younger boys have both played for Scotland at cricket. They both spent some time on the books at counties. And Chris was fortunate enough to play in an incredible match in 2018 when Scotland defeated England. So that was, an interesting moment for me. But that gives me an awful lot of pride and joy. And I always say to people, if you were to offer me the chance of, winning a Grand Slam for Scotland or watching my kids play sport for Scotland, I'd always take the latter. I take incredible joy, and it's given me a sense of how my own parents must have felt when they watched me play, and an appreciation of that. In terms of the downside, we were talking earlier, unfortunately, my wife has been diagnosed with bowel cancer and has just started a treatment of chemotherapy. And, I think that has, it was quite a shock to us because it was quite a quick event, for want of a better word of describing it. And I think when you sit in a room and the surgeon comes in and, tells you the person you loved and have lived with for the last 30 plus years has got cancer, that's a fairly salutary moment, and your world suddenly falls apart, and all the plans that you've made of to stay together and live together and just get thrown up in the air. And it's really tests your personal resilience. I think the other most challenging thing about it was telling the kids about that. And so, I think it's really tested our resilience. And, we talk a lot about resilience on our programs, and we talk a lot about how to develop resilience. And, there's been a bit of physician heal thyself in that regard. So some of the things that you talk to people about, you find yourself reflecting on, okay, well, I'm feeling this way. I need to change the way I think about this, and consequently alter the neurochemistry so that I'll feel differently and behave differently. And I think the important thing of sort of talking to each other, my wife and I talking to each other about it, and not sort of burying either how we feel or what we're concerned about, so that we have these conversations in the open and get used to them, and they become a matter of course. And I think the other point is, you really value and live each day as it comes. You can't predict what's going to happen, and so you really live in the moment and don't worry too much about the things that you can't control. So it is that piece around, there's a lot of stuff which is going to be out of our control over the next 6 months or so going forward. Let's not worry about that. Let's worry about the things that we can control and influence, and focus on those and work hard to control those things. So, and I think that applies to, the joy of watching kids, focus on the things you can control and be in the moment, experience and live each day as it comes.
Well, firstly, I'm very sorry to hear that. I think, did you say your wife is called Jane?
Yes. Yeah.
And my thoughts are with you and Jane as you go through that.
Thank you.
Everybody's experience is different, but I can relate from personal experiences that we've had. But no one can really understand what it's like for you. But I suppose my question is, when others have got this situation, a friend or someone they care about has somebody in their family who goes through what you and your wife are going through right now, what would you advise them to do? Because some people don't know what to do, and so they don't speak to you, and other people ring you up and they just muck in and help out. What works for you? Like, doesn't work for everybody, but what would you advise?
I think your point is absolutely right. Different people react very differently to these situations. So, if I think of a great friend of mine, Doddy Weir, who, was sadly diagnosed with motor neuron disease and died at the back end of last year. He's just a larger than life character. He was really clear about, living every day as it came. And trying to find a cure for MND, and he was very open and positive about that. And I took my hat off to him because I don't think if I was in the same situation as him, I would want to be as public or living my life as publicly as he did. And so I think different people react in different ways. I mean, I think from our perspective, we don't want to hide it or not talk about it, because it's just part of life, isn't it? As they say, the certainties in life are death and taxes, aren't they? And it's one of those things. You just we have to be happy and comfortable talking about it, because if we bury it, then it's going to make it harder to deal with and harder to cope with, I think. So our view is to try and be as open as you possibly can about these situations and talk about these things. And I think it's harder for people who aren't as close to it, perhaps, as Jane or I are. It's hard for me to talk to Jane sometimes about how she's feeling. When you go for you go in for the operation, or you go for your first batch of chemotherapy, or all of these things are new and uncertain for her, and they're new and uncertain for me as well. But you want to be there and be supportive, but equally you don't want to spend a lot of time talking about it to build concern or worry. So it's a hard balance to strike, and we just have to learn on the go, I think.
Yeah, well, look, thank you for talking about that, because a lot of people avoid talking about it, but these are real things. And it actually is these moments when the best of us can come out as well as the worst of us. And I recently in December did the Hoffman process. I don't know if you came across it at all, but it was, I think, in my 60s, the most powerful course I've ever done. And as a result of that, I'm able to have very profound conversations with my brother Graham, who lived a savage knifing attack, and someone broke in, tried to burn him and the family alive. And there's a court case coming up next month by the person who's accused of doing that. But now I'm having real conversations with Graham. He, interesting enough, we have a rugby connection too, because he played for the North of England schoolboys against the Australians, and he was a number 8. So rugby is dear to his heart. But I just say that having these conversations with your loved ones is the most powerful thing I think we can do, but often we avoid them. They talk about masterpiece conversations, if you can, with your parents, the kind of conversations that people wish they'd had. My father was killed when I was 2.5, so I never had those kind of conversations. And my mother died some 12 years ago, but I did manage to have some good conversations with her. And I think your point, and it's a really strong Stoic philosophy about living every day as it comes and controlling the controllables, what you do have control over and what you don't, it's come through in your life philosophy. Now that you're at the age you're at, and you've got these children, now you've got a granddaughter, age 1, congratulations.
Thank you.
Very, very special moment. If you went back to visit David Sole, age sort of 17 or 18, running around as you were in your white shorts at school, playing with the blue top, what bit of advice would you give? Like, David, don't worry about that. Really, honestly, now I'm in my 60s. These kind of things don't matter, but that does matter. What advice would you give to a young person now about what really matters and what doesn't?
Yeah, I think I'd advise them not to be constrained by self-limiting beliefs. I think if I had different conversations in my career, or as I was working my way through things, I would have perhaps taken a slightly different path, which might have been really interesting for us as a family and as a family unit and from a career perspective. But I think I probably didn't have the conversations because I expected the answer to be not the answer that I would want. so I had some self-limiting beliefs around that. And I think, we all have self-limiting beliefs, I think. And if you can recognize what they are and be conscious of them and then actually try and address them, that can be enormously helpful. I know I would have had a different conversation with someone at Diageo when I was thinking about what next for me, and that could have taken me on a completely different career path and taken us as a family on a completely different life journey, which might have been really, really interesting. And I kind of, I don't regret it, but I would have liked to have had the conversation, and there was something nagging at me, stopping me from having that conversation.
I can relate to that, David. I definitely can. And then my next thought was this one about one thing you could change in your life if you could live it again. What crucible moments have shaped you? You mentioned already about going down the vet path rather than the languages, but is there anything else that, as you look back, a crucible moment that sort of shaped your life, and sliding doors moment, it could have been this, it could have been that?
I think we all have mistakes that we've made, which we regret or rue, but I don't think there's anything fundamental. I mean, I'm really content in my life. I've been very fortunate to marry an amazing woman, and she's been an incredible mother to 4 outstanding kids who are now breeding themselves. So I think there's decisions we might have made over certain things which, oh God, why the hell did you do that? But from a sort of seminal moment, I think you just have to treat them as learning experiences, don't you, rather than rue the fact that you've screwed up or made a mistake.
Yeah, you'll probably have come across David Goggins. Have you listened to or read any of his books?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so David Goggins is an extreme endurance sporting man in America. And he was the only black boy in a white school where some of the parents were in the Ku Klux Klan. His father was a gangster and beat his mother frequently, almost to death, and beat him up too when he was very small. He stuttered, he lacked confidence, and then eventually turned things around from being massively obese to going to do US Navy SEAL selection, not just once, Hell Week, once, twice, 3 times. And his view was, no such thing as failure. It's just your first attempt. You're going to have another go. And he then went on to do Delta selection and Rangers as well, and then become a smoke jumper. But he does these incredible endurance events and cycling 444 miles in 2 days and running through the night, but constant legs dripping blood and things, and carries on going. Yeah. And so his books are very inspiring. I would one day love to interview him. But his first book was Can't Hurt Me, which after all the abuse he went through, I think he learned to cope with anything. Whatever the SEALs instructors threw at him in the freezing water, they couldn't hurt him. And then his other book he's just written is Never Finished. And I think of that with some of the things that you've done. I'm going to go around what we call the Inspiring Leadership Compass, some of the research that we did about what makes inspiring men and women. You obviously read and studied and created your own models, so many different models of leadership, and particularly the one on inclusive leadership, which I do share up and sign up with very much your approach there. But if you look at the first one, MQ, moral quotient, the values, beliefs, and you have some strong ones. I'm always intrigued, not for you specifically, but people who are in the industry, those who used to be, or still are, in the tobacco industry, and the doctors in their white coats going, I smoke Camel cigarettes and they're very good for you, smoke them. And then the whole marketing push on alcohol, this is really good for you, drink. And then of course my mother, my late mother-in-law was an alcoholic. She was reliant on it, and we all went to Al-Anon. And you see the damage that alcohol can do, as well as the happy side of it. I was in the military, and everybody was a big force fed, happy hours and being locked in a room with a crate of beer to drink it. So I just wonder, from the sort of moral integrity point of view, particularly where you've got companies like Pepsi and Danone and others pushing, ultra high processed foods, which of course are causing problems with diabetes and cancer. 1% of the population was obese in the UK in 1950. Now it's 23.5%. And what's changed? Ultra high processed foods and Cokes and Pepsis. So how do people, in your mind, in the drinks industry, cope with knowing the dark side as well as the fun side?
Well, I think, it's 20 plus years since I was at Diageo, but we still do some work with some of the Scotch whisky companies up here. I think corporately they have a very strong ethos around everything in moderation. And they, contribute to the Portman Group, which is the kind of the industry body to that kind of almost regulates that. And they're very conscious of, not sponsoring underage or supporting underage drinking or endorsing those sorts of things. So they do have a moral compass. At the end of the day, as you say, addiction of that nature leads to problems, as in the same way that betting leads to incredible problems. And for me, I think that is an industry which could do with a little bit more regulation and constraint in its advertising. I think it's a tough one to look at. You talked about obesity. Obesity is a very significant contributor to cancer, and yet Stand Up to Cancer support the Great British Bake Off, which is all about baking cakes which make you fat. So there seems to be an ethical dilemma, I think, in almost everything that you come across. I know that CI UK don't invest in, I think it's either DHL or FedEx, because they transport filters which are used in the tobacco industry. So, on the one hand, you see scrutiny around ethical investment, coming under, incredible pressure. But on the other hand, they're quite happy to support something which, makes you fat, because it's populist and it's great for, earning some money. So, I think we're faced with these sorts of dilemmas and judgments, wherever we're going to be. And I think, you talked about integrity and moral quotient. I think that integrity is really important, and being able to look in the mirror and saying, have I done the right thing by myself, by my organization, by my values at the end of the day, is a really important thing to be comfortable with.
I think it is, and it was triggered. I'm dyslexic, so I listen to lots of audiobooks rather than reading them. But at the moment, I'm listening to Henry Dimbleby on Ravenous with Jemima Lewis about how to get ourselves and our planet into shape. And he wrote the paper which Boris then, as usual with most Boris things, he sort of steamrolled it over it, and all that we could do with a sugar and salt tax, which would still allow these companies to produce stuff, but just like the sugar tax reduced the amount of sugar that was in things, we could have done an awful lot, and he completely dodged dealing with the issue. But it is interesting about the impact on the planet, and I recommend it to people listening. Ravenous by Henry Dimbleby. Thank you for that, Dave. That's a very interesting one. Purpose is the next one, PQ. You've had a life full of purpose, whether it be, captaining the Scottish rugby team, or the executive coaching that you've done, and setting up the school for CEOs. How would you capture people who are trying to think about a life purpose and they're drifting a bit, and you found purpose, but how would you advise someone if there was a tip or something you could? It's a big topic, but if you were to give one top tip about getting meaning and purpose in your life.
Yeah, as you say, it is a big topic. I did some work on it when I was on a program with Sue Knight many years ago, and I got very stuck trying to figure out what my purpose was. And I think you've got to be prepared to get stuck and work through it, because when you do work through it, it can be incredibly simple. And organizations are looking at purpose now, and I'm always astounded by organizations that come up with a really simple, clear, memorable purpose, because very often they are the most unsexy organizations that you might come across, and so it is well worth the effort getting stuck, because when you come out the other side, the value that it creates is fantastic. And we talked about resilience. Having a clear purpose in life really helps your resilience, because it provides you with that North Star to sort of anchor yourself to.
Yeah, no, I love that combination, that link from purpose to resilience, which actually also links onto health quotient, which is the next one. You, more than anybody, particularly with what I'm afraid you're going through with Jane, your wife, are very aware of our own health and our human body's fallibility to illnesses and all that goes on. But what tips would you give for people listening about, tip on your physical health, which has been very important to you throughout your life, and one on looking after your mental health?
Well, I think there's far more scrutiny now on wellness in organizations, and so physical health has become increasingly up organizations' agenda. I think probably driven by the pandemic, where people were concerned about burnout and the kind of existential threat that COVID brought to the world. So I think wellness is really important, and it encompasses everything from diet to fitness to sleep to drinking and all the things we've touched on, and so I think being conscious of the impact of kind of physiological wellness and mental wellness, because they are inextricably linked. As it was Juvenal, I think, who said sound mind and sound body all those years ago. So if the Romans got it, nothing's changed much. And we have so much technology that can support us with that, to act as our conscience, to say you need to do a few more steps this week, or it's time you went back to the gym, or you didn't sleep particularly well, you shouldn't have had that third glass of wine, or whatever it is. Use technology to help us in this, and I think generally we need to be kind to ourselves, because I think sometimes we beat ourselves into a pulp, trying to do the right thing for our organizations, whereas actually what we should really be doing is being kind and resourceful to ourselves, and giving ourselves the best chance for us to be at our best.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting, and particularly at the stage that you and I are at, where we every now and again need a challenge. I've just accepted a challenge this morning where I'm going to cycle 600 kilometers over 5 days with my friend Adam Fox Edwards, who was in the tornado pilot in the Gulf War, and we've stayed friends from PricewaterhouseCoopers. And so it's raising money for Help for Heroes, and also for the Inspiring Leadership Foundation for the violence against women and girls. We're going to be cycling alongside many of the veterans, people who've lost limbs and been injured in wars, to raise money for Help for Heroes. But that suddenly makes me realize, A, I'm going to have to get a good bike, and B, I'm going to have to get on that bike and cycle a lot in the remaining 7 weeks before it happens. So, but it is good having a goal. EQ is the next one. You spoke well about EQ and being almost like your number one thing about inspiring leaders that you've met. If you were to give people who are listening, who are super clever people listening, but maybe they've under-indexed on EQ and not quite developed it, in your experience, what's an easy win for people to start to develop? Because it is something you can develop. It's not you're born with it, that's what it is. What's your tip about developing EQ?
Well, I think first understand what it is, because I think very often when you talk about emotional intelligence, people equate that to empathy. And empathy is one facet of it. It depends on the models that you look at, whether it's Reuven Bar-On's or Daniel Goleman's, or there are other models, and there's a model that we use which has 10 facets. Empathy is one of them. Self-awareness is another. Self-confidence, self-reliance, self-control, adaptability, optimism. The research tells us that when they surveyed successful leaders, 90% of them scored highly on optimism. Self-actualization, all of these sort of things are facets of emotional intelligence. And of course, if you over-index on one or more of them, a strength can become a weakness. For example, if you score too highly on self-control, no one will ever know what you're feeling, because you're always under so much control. People won't know. Conversely, if you think about straightforwardness as a facet of emotional intelligence, emotionally intelligent people are straightforward. They say it how it is. But if you're too straightforward, that borders into being blunt. So I'd say understand, what makes up emotional intelligence, and the first part of that any learning cycle is to develop some self-awareness. So be clear about where you have the opportunities to develop. Because in doing that, you shift from a state of unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence. Yeah. And once you're there, you've got choice around, what you do, how you act, how you behave to become consciously competent. Yeah. And the more you practice, the more intuitive it becomes.
Lovely. And it's a very nice way of describing it. I had the pleasure of working for many years with Reuven Bar-On. He helped us shape our compass model. And almost caught up with him when I was in Israel a couple of months ago. But he's now in his late 70s or almost 80. I think he's about to be 80. But a very interesting guy, fought in 3 or 4 Arab-Israeli wars and saw battlefield shock of what happened to people and therefore studied it. And of course, Daniel Goleman made something of his work in the background of the psychometric, and the two worked so well together. Taking your earlier comment about inclusive leadership, the next one is what we call CQ, collaborative, cognitive, and cultural intelligence. That sort of respect for diversity, equality, and inclusion. What's your top tip? It's a very topical issue. It's salient at the moment for people to be much better at being inclusive. What would be a good tip you'd give people?
Yeah, I think we have our own model around inclusive leadership, which is very simple and straightforward. It's an ABC model. I like things in threes. I like things which are a simple moniker that I can remember. But I'm going to take it in reverse order. So C is curiosity. I think people have to be curious about themselves and about others. So we know we all have biases. So we need to understand what our biases are and what the consequences of those biases playing out are. Because again, if we can bring the unconscious to the conscious, we can then actually make significant change in terms of how we act and behave. And of course, being curious about others, being curious about other cultures, other people, what's important to them, what are their values and beliefs, what environment do they thrive in, or what environment stifles them, and so really understanding how you can create the environment for others to be at their best is really important. And B stands for behaviors, which is pretty simple and straightforward. Inclusive behaviors, showing that you accept, value, support, and the contribution of others. And that's not to say you have to agree with it. I think you've got to create the right environment. You've got to create the psychologically safe environment so that you can have constructive conflict or positive disagreement. But that is not going to be taken personally. It's for the good of the organization, for the good of the team, for the good of whoever it is, so you're going to get to the right decision. So that thinking about what are inclusive behaviors. And finally, the A stands for accountability. It's about holding people to account and calling out people when they aren't behaving in an inclusive way or collaborative way, as you said, and being comfortable to hold anyone in the organization to account, irrespective of what level you are. And that can be quite a challenge if you're a junior or a subordinate and you're seeing your leader or your boss displaying non-inclusive behaviors. That's quite a tough call, but it's absolutely critical if you're going to make a difference.
I love that ABC. It's a very nice, very clear model: accountability, behaviors, and curiosity, and it resonates strongly. I have an offsite I'm doing with a team next week, and I think that would be very pertinent for what behaviors they need to show. Next, resilience that we've talked about, and that link between resilience, health, and also purpose as well. What would be a top tip for people having greater resilience? And as you say, you've got to be careful not to over-index, because you can just drive yourself goal obsessed and then die on Mount Everest because you're going for the summit when actually you should have turned back at 4 o'clock, but you're still heading for the summit at 6 at night. What would be your tip on resilience and also managing that?
Yeah, so I'm a great believer in understanding some of the neurochemistry that underpins how we feel, and understanding what's going on in our brain. Without saying that I'm a neuroscientist, because I certainly wouldn't consider myself that. But in kind of learning about how our brain operates, and how our reptilian brain can hijack our prefrontal cortex and stop us from making logical, rational decisions. That's a really important skill and attribute to master. So for me, resilience is about understanding the think, feel, behave sequence, and recognizing that the neurochemistry will change and will impact how we sometimes think about a situation, and that then drives the emotional response, and consequently our behavioral response, which is driven by how we're feeling. So understanding that is is really key to, I think, building and developing resilience, and knowing the things which are going to kick us off course as well.
Very good, very good. Well, brand is the next one, the penultimate one before legacy. And you spend a lot of time doing psychometrics with people and doing 360 with them. What have you found the benefits of leaders doing 360, and whether you're bought into it or not? What's your view on 360s and how useful it is to get a view on your own brand, what people say about you when you're not in the room?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. We had a CEO of a FTSE 50 company talking on one of our programs, and he said, I have a 360 done on me by my leadership team every year, and I publish it. So I publish what people have said about me, and I'm really clear about what my work-ons are for the year. So I think 360s are a very useful tool to develop self-awareness. And it's back to that point. If you are aware of your blind spots, you can do something about them. And so if you know how you're perceived by your team, in your organization, then you can either choose to change or not, depending on what your desires and ambitions are. And sometimes it's okay not to change. You might not want to. You might want to be known as the tyrant or the cost cutter or whatever the 360 says about you. So, but I do think they're really useful tools, and we've developed a tool to specifically for our inclusive leadership model.
Yeah, great. Okay, and the final one before we go on to executive teams and book and then top tip would be legacy. I mean, you've left a legacy in your lifetime already. If you do nothing more, unlike my sergeant major said, "Sir, congratulations, you're a legacy in your own lunchtime." And I think that was an insult, but you are a legacy in your own lifetime. But as people are thinking about what legacy they want to leave, what would be your tip on leaving a legacy, leaving things better than you found them, stewardship, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think it's in terms of that, it's really important to focus on the things that are important in life. So it's not about how many businesses you've sold or the wealth that you've created. It's about we're put on this planet to procreate, and our biological desires here are actually to create a next generation. And I think that is the most important thing about a legacy: creating a next generation which holds good values and leaves the planet in a better place than they arrived in it.
Yeah, that's a lovely one. Now we're on to teams, executive teams, but you've been in teams from back at school, whether it's hockey, cricket, rugby, whatever. You've always been forming teams, captaining teams. But in business, when someone listening has a toxic team or an individual in a team that's really gone toxic, what's your top tip on what, if there's many things they can do, but what would you briefly advise them to start thinking about doing when things have gone toxic or they've inherited something toxic?
Yeah, I think that is a really challenging issue, because I think it obviously depends on the context and the situation and the individuals in concern, but particularly if the individual is a high performer and yet contributing to a toxic culture, you've got a call to make in terms of what's important to you. So the first thing you need to do is decide whether performance or culture is most important.
Well, let me make it, zone it in on an example which might be helpful. Successful team, an individual whose team is doing well. He's looking down on his team, and they work well for him, but he really doesn't care about the team he's part of, and he often sort of throws social hand grenades into the room and closes the door and undermines the leader and the team and the event they're trying to do. What would you do about someone like that who thinks they're the smartest person in the room and they don't need to do this kind of thing? And it's a bit, just paying lip service to that. What would you do about someone like that?
Well, I'm a great believer to, you can either change the people or you can change the people.
Mm.
And I'm a great believer that it's important to give people the opportunity to change. So making them aware of the consequences and impact of their behaviors, and making them really clear about, and giving a clear understanding of the detrimental effect that they're having on the team that they're a member of, and why it's important that they might change, and the consequences of them potentially changing on the broader team. And I think you've got to be really clear in that messaging. And then if they don't, then you've got a tough decision to make. That's when you say, okay, well, actually this isn't acceptable, and what I'm not prepared to tolerate is this sort of behavior in my team. So they would have to go, in my view.
Yeah.
And I think it's always interesting in organizations, more often than not, people are saying, I wonder why they took so long to get rid of that person.
They always do, don't they? Yeah, they do. Time and again, they delay and dither. They don't want to upset things, but people are seeing the leader lacking courage. They're going, why are they accepting this toxic behavior? He's not living our values, but yet he's letting him off because he makes a lot of money. But that's not the only value that matters to him. Yeah.
It's interesting. We have saying it. Never met anyone who wishes they waited a bit longer before they fired someone.
Yeah, that's very, very good saying. I love that one. Definitely. Okay. Well, look, we're now on to the favorite book and then your top tip. What would be a favorite book you'd recommend people to read or listen that you've enjoyed recently, David?
Oh gosh, there's so many. I think Jim Collins's book, Good to Great, is timeless. I can constantly refer back to Level 5 Leader, the chapter on Level 5 leadership and that. There's a terrific book by Owen Eastwood called Belonging, which is about creating a culture of belonging. Owen's a super guy. He's a New Zealander with a Maori background, and he talks a lot about the Maori background and how they create a sense of belonging, and the issues of whakapapa, which is a united chain of people, and it's about their moment in the sun. I'm a big fan of Joanne Lippman as well, who's written a book called Win-Win, When Business Works for Women and Works for Everyone. That's how it's published in the UK. She's just written another book called Next, which is about career transitions. And super writer. So those would be the three that I should only give you one, but they're all good. So Belonging, Good to Great, and Win-Win, plus Next, if you want to have a listen to that. I will definitely be dipping into those. So David, would you introduce yourself? It's going to be a standalone clip now. Just say who you are and what you're currently doing, and give us your 2-minute top leadership tip, please. Sure. So I'm David Sole. I'm managing partner of the School for CEOs and chairman of Worldwide Cancer Research. My top tip, I think for leaders, it's about having the confidence and courage to admit they've made a mistake or they don't know the answer to something. We have to remember it's about humility and humanity. Because we're human beings rather than human doings. So no one has all the answers, but if you have the humility and confidence, you'll be able to ask the right questions to get them.
Yeah, I love that one. Well, David Sole, OBE, thank you very much indeed for being on the Inspiring Leadership podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure. and a personal ambition of mine to have time with you, because I've always admired you from afar. So David, thank you for your contribution.
Been a pleasure. Thanks, Jonathan.